Hi friends! Today's story about pumpkins is called The Biggest Pumpkin Ever. Once there were two mice who fell in love with the same pumpkin. Clayton the house mouse, noticed it one day in the vegetable garden. It was still little and green, but Clayton thought he could make it grow really big. It might even get big enough to win the grand prize at the town pumpkin contest. Desmond the field mouse discovered the pumpkin the same day. He thought that if he helped it grow, it could become the biggest jack-o'-lantern in the whole neighborhood. So we have Clayton the house mouse and Desmond the field mouse. That afternoon, Clayton watched the pumpkin. He also mixed up some fertilizer of manure and water, and he spread the mixture around the pumpkin to make it grow larger. Do you see the pumpkin? That very same night, Desmond went into the garden, and he watered the pumpkin too. He also spread some manure mixed with water around it. They're both doing this to the same pumpkin. The next day, Clayton watered and fertilized the pumpkin again, and that night, Desmond did the same, and the pumpkin began to grow. Look at the pumpkin. By the end of the month, the pumpkin was so large, Clayton could not believe his eyes. My goodness, said Clayton's mother. And it's not even full grown, Clayton shrugged. All I do is water it, he said. Clayton's mother whispered in his ear, If you want the pumpkin to grow faster, she said, you should use sugar water. That night, Desmond brought his brother Morris to see the pumpkin. Morris knew everything there was to know about growing things. That's some pumpkin, he said. Desmond shrugged. All I do is water it, he said. Morris whispered, You should try using sugar water. The same idea. The next day, Clayton dug a hole beside the pumpkin vine. In the hole, he placed a bowl of water. Sugar water. He cut into the vine a few inches from the pumpkin, and the cut he put on one end of it a candle wick, and then the other end in the bowl of the sugar water. See how he did that? That night on the other side of the pumpkin, Desmond did the exact same thing. And within a week, the pumpkin was twice the size it had been. And within 2 weeks, it was absolutely enormous. Clayton was amazed. He ran down the road and peeked into his friend Jimmy's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin Jimmy was growing for the contest looked much smaller. Clayton scratched his head. I have an amazing pumpkin, he said out loud. I think it's going to win the contest. Do you think so, though? That night, Desmond and his brother Morris spent a long time looking at the pumpkin. How do you think it got this big? Desmond said. Morris shrugged. A little luck and a little skill. It's going to make some jack-o'-lantern, said Desmond. It sure is, said Morris. A week later, Clayton noticed the pumpkin was bigger than the family car. During the day, everyone he knew came to admire it, and at night all the field mice gathered round to do the same thing. And by now, summer was almost over, and in a week the pumpkin would be full grown and start turning yellowish and then orange. A few weeks after that, it would be ripe and ready for the pumpkin contest. Clayton could hardly wait. The pumpkin was growing so fast it would soon be bigger than his house. Then he had a terrible thought. If the pumpkin is so big, how would he get it to the contest? It wouldn't fit in his red wagon. It wouldn't fit in his truck. Clayton decided to worry about this when the time came. And that night the weather grew colder. Thinking there might be an early frost, Clayton rushed out to the pumpkin with his blanket. One was not enough. Soon he was rushing back and forth, carrying all the blankets from the house. As he worked, he hummed a little song, and as he hummed, he heard something else singing. Someone else was singing. He began to realize that someone else was also covering the pumpkin with blankets. Look, they can't see each other. Desmond, too, had seen the danger of an early frost, so he, too, had brought blankets for the pumpkin. And as he worked, he sang a little song. And as he sang, he began to realize that someone else was working and humming, too. Clayton stopped humming. He put down his pile of blankets, and he peered around the corner. Desmond stopped singing. He put down his blankets, and he peered around the corner. Then the two of them bumped heads and fell down. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Clayton. "You've been feeding the pumpkin," said Desmond. "That's why it got so big," said Clayton. "That's why it got so big," said Desmond. And they burst out laughing. When everything had been explained, Clayton said, "I know how I'll win the contest if I get the pumpkin to town." Desmond smiled. "I'll help you. Let me carve the pumpkin into a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween when the contest is over." "It's a deal," said Clayton. "Deal," said Desmond, and they shook on it. There's the pumpkin contest. I wonder who will win. The morning of the contest was bright and sunny. Mice were bringing their pumpkins to the town square by truck and car and wagon, and some were rolling them along the ground. Suddenly, they all stopped short. Over the fields came the biggest pumpkin anyone had ever seen. It was being pulled by 100 field mice on motorcycles. When the pumpkin reached town, it was so big for any of the streets, Clayton had to explain why they couldn't bring it into the square. The mayor understood at once. He led the crowd to the great pumpkin and printed the first prize ribbon on its side and pinned the first prize ribbon on the side. Then everyone danced around it. "Who would believe this?" said Clayton as he danced. "Who would ever believe this?" said Desmond at the same time. When the celebration was over, 100 field mice pulled the pumpkin back to the field. The day before Halloween, they carved it into the best jack-o'-lantern ever. And on Halloween night, its wonderful smiling face could be seen glowing for miles around. Bye, friends.